They brutally hacked her to pieces, mounted her severed head on a pike, and paraded it through the streets of Paris to terrorize her best friend. And this isn't some medieval horror story. This is what happened to Princess de Lamballe, Marie Antoinette's closest companion, during one of the most savage executions in human history. What you're about to hear will shock you to your core, because the reality of what happened on September 3rd, 1792, is so brutal, so unthinkably violent, that Hollywood couldn't even put it on screen. But here's the thing. Half the stories you've heard about this execution are complete lies, fabricated decades later for political propaganda and shock value. So, buckle up, because we're about to separate the horrifying truth from the twisted myths. And trust me, the real story is more chilling than any fiction. When most people think about the French Revolution, their minds immediately jump to the guillotine, that cold, mechanical blade that became the symbol of revolutionary justice. Clean, quick, efficient. But what happened to Princess de Lamballe wasn't a state execution. It wasn't justice. It was a lynching. It was ritualistic murder by a blood-drunk mob that had completely lost its humanity. And the woman they butchered, her only crime was loyalty. Absolute, unwavering loyalty to her best friend, even when that loyalty meant walking straight into her own death. Marie-Thérèse Louise de Savoie-Carignan was born in 1749 in the rolling hills of northern Italy, destined for a life of privilege that would ultimately become her death sentence. At 17, she married the Prince de Lamballe, securing not just a title, but access to one of the most massive fortunes in all of Europe. Picture this. We're talking about wealth so vast that it made even other royals jealous. But here's where the story takes its first tragic turn. Within just 1 year of marriage, she was a widow. At 18 years old, she found herself alone with a fortune, a title, and an uncertain future. That's when she made the decision that would define the rest of her short life. She entered the glittering, dangerous world of the French court at Versailles. And it was there, among the mirrors and marble, the silk gowns and whispered secrets, that she met Marie Antoinette. The connection was instant, electric. These two women, both young, both navigating the treacherous waters of French aristocracy, became more than friends. They became sisters. The Austrian-born queen, already struggling with her outsider status, found in Lamballe something precious beyond measure. Genuine loyalty in a world built on betrayal. But this friendship would prove to be both women's downfall. Marie Antoinette appointed Lamballe as the superintendent of her household, a position that wasn't just about managing servants or organizing parties. This was family. Lamballe wasn't staff. She was the queen's inner circle, her confidant, her emotional support system. And as the French people began to hate their queen with increasing intensity, that hatred spread like poison to everyone around her. The propaganda machine against Marie Antoinette was already in full swing, but now, Lamballe found herself caught in the crossfire. Disgusting pamphlets circulated through Paris, filled with twisted rumors and vile accusations. The woman who had once been seen as a tragic young widow was now being transformed into a supervillain in the public imagination. They called her a corrupting influence on the queen. They accused her of being an Austrian spy, an enemy of France itself. The loyal friend had become a target. Then came July 14th, 1789, the storming of the Bastille. The world, as these aristocrats knew it, began crumbling around them. The monarchy that had seemed eternal was suddenly fragile, vulnerable, under attack from every direction. Panic swept through the noble classes as they realized the mob's anger wasn't just directed at abstract concepts of inequality. It was personal, it was violent, and it was coming for them. Aristocrats began fleeing France in droves, abandoning their estates, their titles, their entire lives to escape the revolutionary fury. Lamballe had the perfect opportunity to join this exodus. She was in London, safe from the chaos consuming her homeland. Her friends begged her to stay. Her family pleaded with her to remain in England, where she could live out her days in comfort and security. Any rational person would have stayed. Any person who valued their own life would have chosen safety. But Lamballe wasn't just any person. Her loyalty to Marie Antoinette wasn't casual friendship. It was absolute devotion. Even as reports reached London of increasing violence, even as she heard stories of aristocrats being dragged from their homes and murdered in the streets, she made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone else. She was going back. She was going back to Paris, back to her friend, back to what she knew was almost certain death. Before she left London, She did something that shows just how clearly she understood what she was walking into. She wrote her will. This wasn't optimistic preparation. This wasn't hoping for the best while preparing for the worst. This was a woman who knew she was signing her own death warrant, but chose to do it anyway because her friend needed her. When Lamballe returned to France, she walked straight into a nightmare that was getting worse by the day. She was present during the royal family's failed escape attempt, watching as their last hope for survival crumbled around them. On June 20th, 1792, a mob attacked the palace itself, surging through the halls of power like a human tsunami. Eyewitnesses described how Lamballe, even in the midst of this terrifying assault, was concerned only with the queen's safety, staying by her side as chaos erupted around them. Then came August 10th, 1792, the day the monarchy was completely overthrown. The royal family was imprisoned in the temple, but Lamballe was separated from her friend and thrown into La Force prison. Picture this scene. After years of living in palaces, sleeping in silk sheets, dining off golden plates, she was now locked in a cramped, filthy cell, surrounded by the sounds of other prisoners who knew, just as she did, that they were probably going to die. But what happened next was beyond anything anyone could have imagined. By late August 1792, Paris had descended into complete paranoia. Enemy armies were marching toward the city. The revolution was under threat from multiple directions. And in this atmosphere of terror, a terrible logic began to take hold among the revolutionaries. They became convinced that the prisoners, especially the aristocratic prisoners, were spies and traitors who would help the enemy destroy the revolution from within. Georges Danton, one of the most powerful revolutionary leaders, gave a speech that would seal the fate of hundreds of innocent people. To conquer them, he declared, we must dare and dare again and dare forever. These words weren't just a rallying cry, they were a call for blood. September 2nd, 1792. What historians call the September massacres began. For 5 days, Paris became a slaughterhouse. Mobs swarmed the prisons, setting up fake tribunals, conducting mock trials that lasted minutes before declaring prisoners guilty of crimes they never committed. The courtyards of these prisons became execution sites where hundreds of people were hacked to death with sabers, pikes, axes, hammers, whatever weapons the crowd could find. The streets of Paris literally ran red with blood. Bodies were piled in the courtyards like cordwood. The smell of death hung over the city like a plague. And in this orgy of violence, Princess de Lamballe represented the ultimate prize. She wasn't just any aristocrat, she was Marie Antoinette's best friend, the symbol of everything the mob hated about the old regime. On September 3rd, 1792, the guards came for her. They dragged her from her cell and brought her before a tribunal that was less a court than a slaughter committee. Picture this scene. A table stained with blood and wine. Men who had been drinking and killing for days. The courtyard behind them piled high with mutilated corpses. The stench must have been overwhelming. The sight must have been beyond description. When Lamballe was brought before this mockery of justice, she saw the bodies. She saw what had happened to the other prisoners. She knew exactly what was about to happen to her. But even then, even facing this horror, they gave her one final chance. The tribunal demanded she take an oath, swear hatred to the king and queen, denounce her former life, and she might live. Her response has echoed through history. I readily swear to the first, she said, referring to hatred of the king, but I cannot swear to the second. It is not in my heart. Even facing certain death, she would not betray Marie Antoinette. Someone in the crowd whispered to her, if you do not swear, you are dead. Her reply was simple, resigned, and heartbreaking. Whether I die sooner or later is a matter of indifference to me. The tribunal president then spoke the coded words that everyone understood. Let Madame be set at liberty. This wasn't freedom. It was a signal to the mob waiting outside. It meant, she's yours. What happened next was not an execution. It was butchery. The moment Lamballe stepped into the courtyard, the mob fell on her like wild animals. The first blow came from a pike or hammer to the back of her head. Her cap fell off, and her blonde hair tumbled down around her shoulders. A second blow to her forehead sent her crashing to the ground, and then the mob swarmed over her with pikes and sabers. It was brutal. It was chaotic. It was fast. These weren't trained executioners carrying out a sentence. These were ordinary people who had become a death squad, hacking at a defenseless woman with whatever weapons they could find. When it was over, they decapitated her, the ultimate act of degradation and dehumanization. Her body was stripped naked and left in the street like refuse. But even this wasn't enough for the mob's bloodlust. They mounted her severed head on a pike and began a parade through the streets of Paris. Their destination was the Temple prison, where Marie Antoinette was being held. They wanted the queen to see what had happened to her best friend. They wanted to terrorize her, to break her spirit completely. Picture this horrific procession. Hundreds of people marching through the streets, screaming for blood, carrying the head of a woman whose only crime was loyalty. When they reached the temple, they shouted for the queen to come to the window to see what they had done to her friend. Some accounts suggest they even wanted to force Marie Antoinette to kiss her dead friend's lips, though this was prevented by the guards. The guards blocked the windows and informed the queen of what had happened. Marie Antoinette's scream could be heard throughout the prison. She collapsed and spent the entire night weeping. The mob had achieved exactly what they wanted. They had inflicted psychological torture that was perhaps worse than physical death. But here's where we need to separate fact from fiction, because over the years, the story of Lamballe's death has been embellished with details that are simply not true. These myths have become so embedded in popular culture that many people accept them as historical fact, but the evidence simply doesn't support them. The most persistent myths involve sexual desecration, stories of rape, breast mutilation, and genital mutilation. These graphic details have been repeated in countless books and articles, but here's the problem. Contemporary records from 1792 don't mention any of this. These details appear to have been added later, possibly by royalist propagandists trying to make the revolutionaries look even more barbaric than they actually were. The official record of items found in her pockets suggests her body was clothed when discovered, which contradicts many of these sexual assault claims. Then there's the cannibalism myth, the story that her heart was torn out and eaten by members of the mob. This is complete fabrication, created purely for shock value. There is zero credible evidence that this happened. It's the kind of detail that gets added to historical accounts to make them more sensational, more horrifying, but it's not based in reality. Another persistent myth involves a hairdresser supposedly styling and powdering her severed head before it was presented to the queen. This never happened. It's a detail that sounds dramatic, but has no basis in any contemporary account. Some romantic versions of the story claim that secret messages were hidden in her hair for Marie Antoinette. Again, this is pure fiction, a romantic idea that has no proof whatsoever. And the forced kiss myth. Multiple reliable accounts confirm that the queen was not forced to kiss her friend's severed head. The guards prevented the mob from carrying out this final act of cruelty. So why do these fake stories persist? There are several reasons. First, propaganda. Both sides in the French Revolution had reasons to exaggerate the other side's brutality. Second, shock value. Graphic details make stories more memorable and more likely to be repeated. Third, there's something about grotesque horror that appeals to a certain part of human nature, the same impulse that makes people slow down to look at car accidents. But here's the risk of focusing on these fabricated details. We lose sight of the real woman and the real tragedy. The truth about what happened to Princess de Lamballe is horrifying enough without adding fictional embellishments. What actually happened was a lynching, not a state execution. It was ritualistic murder carried out by a mob that had stopped seeing Lamballe as a human being and started seeing her only as a symbol of everything they hated. This is one of the most infamous moments of the French Revolution, not because of mythical sexual violence or cannibalism, but because it represents the moment when political rage completely destroyed human empathy. Her real story is more chilling than any fabrication because it's true. This actually happened. A crowd of ordinary people, shopkeepers, artisans, laborers, became a death squad. They murdered a defenseless woman whose only crime was loyalty to her friend. They turned her death into public entertainment. They used her severed head as a weapon of psychological warfare. This is what political extremism looks like when it's allowed to run completely unchecked. This is what happens when people stop seeing their opponents as human beings and start seeing them as symbols to be destroyed. The mob that killed Lamballe wasn't born evil. They were ordinary people who had been driven to extraordinary hatred by years of propaganda, economic hardship, and political manipulation. Princess de Lamballe's story is ultimately about the human cost of revolution. Revolutions are often necessary. The French Revolution swept away a system that was genuinely oppressive and unfair. But revolutions also create moments like this one, where the line between justice and vengeance disappears completely. What makes her story so tragic is that she saw it coming. She knew what would happen if she returned to France. She could have lived safely in London for the rest of her life, but she chose to come back because her friend needed her. In a world where people regularly betrayed each other for money, power, or simple survival, she chose loyalty even when it meant death. That's what makes this story so powerful and so heartbreaking. It's not just about violence or political chaos. It's about personal loyalty colliding with political fury. It's about friendship surviving in impossible circumstances. It's about a woman who had every reason to abandon her friend but chose to stand by her instead. The irony is that Princess de Lamballe is remembered today almost entirely for how she died rather than how she lived. Her 27 years of life have been overshadowed by her brutal final moments. She was an intelligent woman, a patron of the arts, someone who genuinely cared about the people around her. But history remembers her primarily as the woman whose head was paraded through Paris on a pike. This is the real tragedy of political violence. It reduces complex human beings to symbols and propaganda tools. The mob that killed her didn't see Marie-Thérèse Louise de Savoie-Carignan, a young widow who had chosen loyalty over safety. They saw the enemy, the aristocrat, the traitor. They had been taught to hate everything she represented, and that hatred was so complete that it made them capable of unthinkable brutality. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire story is how quickly ordinary people can become capable of extraordinary violence when they're convinced they're fighting for a righteous,